What was the reaction to Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy?
Burton wrote The Anatomy of Melancholy under the pseudonym Democritus Jr. His book was well received. Literary historian and critic Thomas Warton, 1728–1790, wrote of it. The author's variety of learning, his quotations from rare and curious books, his pedantry sparkling with rude wit and shapeless elegance have rendered it a repertory of amusement and information. Indeed, Burton's treatise is full of satire, and it constitutes a prodigious display of historical and literary knowledge. However, the genius of Burton's Anatomy lies in its attempt to give a naturalistic account of the mind as both distinct from the body and yet intimately connected with it. Burton's theory of human cognition and consciousness rests on his notion of spirit, through which all of the functions and faculties of mind are physically connected with different parts of the body. While mistaken and overly literal by more modern standards, Burton's general project of investigating mind-body correspondence remains a cornerstone of empirical mind-body and mind-brain scientific research to this day.
What have been the major themes and issues in African American philosophy?
Analyses of racism, questions about racial identity, and questions about the reality of race are all important issues in African American philosophy.
What was Charles Peirce's philosophical system?
Peirce's philosophical views had idealist underpinnings. He had four systems. In his first system, 1859–1861, he agreed with Immanuel Kant. 1724–1804, that things in themselves could not be known either in science or philosophy. Science is concerned with phenomena, or what appears in experience. But there is an objective world underlying phenomena, or what is known. There are three kinds of things: 1. Matter, 2. Mind, and 3. God, or it, thou, and I, which Peirce called firstness, secondness and thirdness, respectively. Peirce thought that ideas in God's mind are as material as objects in our experience. However, he encountered logical problems with this system and was not quite satisfied with the relation between the Kantian categories and the things in themselves. In his second system of thought, 1866–1970, Peirce used Hegelian methodology and assumptions to conclude that what was most real was a dynamic system. He thought that the world of experience or phenomena, which he called the phaneron, is entirely made up of signs which are qualities, relations, things, events, everything, and that these signs are all meaningful. The meaning of each sign is part of a system that also contains the object and the interpreton. The object is what the sign is a sign of. The interpreton is the feature or activity of mind that experiences the sign. And, the interpreton is also a sign because everything is a sign, so it also has an object and a second interpreton.
Who was Martin Heidegger?
Martin Heidegger, 1889–1976, was the phenomenological ontologist who first united existentialism with phenomenology, but later revealed that his true concern was ontology. He is considered one of the titans of Western philosophy and had more direct enduring influence over 20th century continental philosophy than any other thinker. Heidegger wrote extensively on the history of philosophy, developing his own phenomenological analyses. His main books include his doctoral dissertation The Doctrine of Judgment in Psychologism, 1914, his habilitation, in Europe, Ph.D. right, 2 dissertations. One to get a degree as a scholar and the second to qualify them to teach on a university level. The Doctrine of Categories and Signification in Duns Scotus, 1914, his most famous being And Time, 1927. And then Introduction to Metaphysics, 1953, What is Called Thinking, 1954, What is Philosophy? 1956, On the Way to Language, 1959, Nietzsche I and II, 1961, and Phenomenology and Theology, 1970. Transcripts of Heidegger's lectures were partly published in 1975, the complete works would constitute over 100 volumes. Heidegger is also known for articles on art and poetry, as well as his essay The Question Concerning Technology.
Is Jürgen Habermas' work wholly theoretical?
No. First, he holds that the ability to see the worthiness of other people's goals is a condition for participation in a discourse community. And second, the subject under discussion should determine what will count as convincing argument. He has expressed optimism that his notion of discourse is compatible with likely global peace among nation-states. Habermas has struggled with the idea of self-determination as an individuating criterion for states, and tried to determine the kinds of negotiations necessary for mutual cooperation within Europe. He has also claimed that dialogues between religious thinkers and secularists can be mutually beneficial even though some of the core beliefs of each group cannot be fully translated into the worldviews of the other. Generally speaking, Habermas' views on rationality, cosmopolitanism, and democratically negotiated universal human goals represent a recasting of modern ideals. Other postmodernists, such as Jean Baudrillard, 1929, Gilles Deleuze, 1925–1995, and Pierre-Félix Guattari, 1930–1992, regard such ideals with greater skepticism and suspicion.
How were virtue ethics rediscovered in analytic philosophy?
Aristotelian virtue ethics, mainly as expressed in Aristotle's 384 to 322b. CE. Nicomachean ethics, were revisited in analytic philosophy to create rationalist moral systems. According to Aristotle, we develop our individual virtues through a rational process of deliberating and then choosing what to do in action. The revival of Aristotelian ethics was sometimes pursued in opposition to other prominent moral systems and moral theories. Philippa Foot, 1920, and Alasdair MacIntyre, 1929, are noteworthy 20th century virtue ethicists.
Who were the scholastics?
The scholastics were the first heavyweight philosophical school of medieval times. Their 11th century founder was St. Anselm of Canterbury, 1033 to 1109, who was followed by Peter Abelard, 1079 to 1142, and Peter Lombard, 1100 to 1160, in the 12th century. During the same time, Jewish and Islamic philosophers reintroduced Aristotle to the West. This innovation culminated in the work of Saint Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225 to 1274, followed by John Duns Scotus, 1266 to 1308.
What characterizes 19th century philosophy as a foundation for current philosophical thought?
Philosophy became fully modern in the 19th century in the sense that 19th century philosophical schools of thought and methods of analysis are still practiced by professional philosophers today. Modern philosophy is characterized by empiricism on the one side and a reaction against empiricism on the other. It consists of a series of inquiries that continue to be used as classic foundations for contemporary thinkers, who build upon it still. Its primary founders flourished in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and they set the stage with problems that gave rise to existentialism and phenomenology, or continental philosophy, American philosophy, or pragmatism, Anglo-American analytic philosophy, including what is now known as philosophy of science, and the new philosophies of post-structuralism, postmodernism, feminism, and race and post-colonialism. The hallmark of modern philosophy has been a constantly renewed awareness of other fields as philosophically interesting, such as social criticism, political science, physical science, psychology, mathematics, logic, and literature, and new understandings of the human subject as both a generator and subject matter of philosophical thought.
Who was Robert Nozick?
Robert Nozick, 1938 to 2002, is considered important for his idea of minimal government. He was educated at Columbia, Princeton, and Oxford universities and became a philosophy professor at Pellegrino University and Harvard. His most influential work was Anarchy, State, and Utopia. 1974, which was written in response to John Rawls, 1921 to 2002, A Theory of Justice, 1971. Additional books by Nozick include Socratic Puzzles, 1997. The Nature of Rationality, 1993, and The Examined Life, 1989.
When did philosophy begin?
In the West, the scientific aspect of philosophy, or abstract general thought about the natural and human worlds, began in ancient Greece in the 7th century B.C., with inquiry about the earth and the cosmos by the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, many of whom continued to flourish in Socrates' time. Between the pre-Socratics and Socrates, the Sophists were the first to focus on the human world. Although their methods were adversarial and perhaps unethical, they were paid for their arguments. Without concern about their truth or the justice of what they were arguing for. With Socrates' activities in the 5th century BCE, and his student Plato's dramatization of Socrates' style of discourse in written dialogues in the 4th century BCE, the true humanistic side of philosophy was founded. The two big subjects of the natural world and the human world endured as the concerns of philosophers. Well after the physical and social sciences branched out on their own. These subjects are also perennial in ordinary life.
What was Thales' contribution as the first philosopher in Western history?
It's not the content of Thales, c. 624 c. 545 BCE, thought that proved to be so important, but rather his willingness to boldly think about the whole of physical existence. Thales' home was Miletus, which had strong ties to Egypt. Like the Egyptians, he believed that the earth floated on water and that water or moisture was the primary substance or stuff of the world. Aristotle thought that Thales had been impressed by the importance of water and fluids for life generally. Indeed, Thales seems to have thought that life is present in every part of the universe and that it was divine. Hence, he is said to have remarked, "Everything is full of gods." Thales' most striking and novel insight was that the movements and qualities of water could be used to explain the behavior of living things, as well as natural events. The behavior of water was, in that way, a primary moving principle. A primary moving principle was a thing that was responsible for the movement of all other things. At the same time that water was held to be the primary stuff of the universe.
What are Venn diagrams?
British philosopher and logician John Venn, 1834–1923, invented the system of logic diagrams named after him, which consisted of the overlapping circles. They can be used to test and demonstrate the validity of inferences. Venn diagrams illustrate collections of sets and their relationships to each other, which are useful in logic theory. A Venn diagram of sets A, B, and C, where one or more sets overlap, it means that they have members in common. It can be seen by the overlapping in this diagram that some things are A, B, and C. Some things are A and B, some things are B and C, and some things are A and C.
Who was Marie-Louise Enkendorf?
She was the pseudonym of Gertrude Keinel, George Simmel's wife, under which she published her own philosophical writings. The Simmels maintained a salon for intellectuals but otherwise enjoyed a conservative, bourgeois family life. They had one son.
What is the origin of materialism, Marxism, and anarchism in the modern era?
Intellectually, they were all reactions against Hegelianism. In society, as political movements, they represented a natural historical progression from the French Revolution, and a reaction against the Industrial Revolution in Europe, as well as against feudalism in Russia.
What was Richard Rorty's concept of philosophy?
Rorty, 1931–2007, viewed philosophy as an ongoing free conversation or exchange of ideas that might be pursued passionately but nonetheless could not arrive at a kind of truth that did not exist. Philosophy was an opportunity to creatively reinvent oneself. Although he continually expressed liberal views, he did not think a rational view of universal human rights was possible to construct, but that empathy and related sentiments could be cultivated by reading literature and through the right early education.
What world facts inform postmodernism?
The term postmodern came from the field of architecture. Meaning after modern, it is a phrase that connotes, sometimes ironically, borrowing from the past in irreverent ways. Postmodern philosophy arose after major historical changes, the different scientific worldviews represented by Albert Einstein's theories of relativity and subatomic physics. The enormous destructive power of 20th century warfare, the liberation of former colonies, as well as women and non-whites in Europe and the United States, the economic, political, and social conditions of post-colonialism, and a breakdown in traditional social institutions such as the nuclear family. Changes in women's roles, global capitalism, new economic inequalities, and environmental crises.
How did Alan Sokal attack postmodernism?
New York University physicist Alan Sokal wrote a spoof of postmodern scholarship titled Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, which was published by the postmodern journal Social Texts in its 1996 Spring/Summer Science Wars issue. When his article came out, Sokal simultaneously confessed his hoax in the academic gossip journal Lingua Franca. He referred to his Social Text article as a pastiche of left-wing cant, fawning references, grandiose quotations, and outright nonsense, which was structured around the silliest quotations I could find about mathematics and physics that recent postmodernist academics had written.
Who is Jürgen Habermas?
Jürgen Habermas, 1929, is a German philosopher and social theorist who combines the critical theory of the Frankfurt School with American pragmatism. With this combination, he is postmodern in his emphasis on public speech and dialogue as a political way of life. His engagements with contemporary thinkers from Jacques Derrida, 1930 to 2004, to John Rawls, 1921 to 2002, to Pope Benedict XVI, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, exemplify his theory. However, it should be noted that unlike most avowed postmodern philosophers, Habermas defends Enlightenment democratic values. Habermas' major works include The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, 1962, Theory and Practice, 1963, On the Logic of the Social Sciences, 1967, Knowledge and Human Interest, 1967, Toward a Rational Society, 1967, Technology and Science as Ideology, 1968, The Theory of Communicative Action, 1981. On the Pragmatics of Communication, 1992, The Post-National Constellation, 1998, Old Europe, New Europe, Core Europe, 2005, The Divided West, 2006, and with Joseph Ratzinger The Dialectics of Secularization, 2007.
What has medicine got to do with the history of philosophy?
The theory and practice of medicine is not usually associated with philosophers or the history of philosophy, except for recognition of the ethical aspects of many medical decisions, for example, abortion, end-of-life issues, and cost of care, medical doctors do not seek out philosophical opinions. And philosophers do not view medicine as part of their normal range of subjects. Nevertheless, until at least the 18th century, medical ideas and practices concerning the human body were closely connected to philosophy in several ways. Since ancient times, beginning with both Plato and Aristotle, philosophers used the kind of knowledge necessary for the practice of medicine as an important example of the nature of practical knowledge, in general. For instance, doctors may agree on the cause and symptoms of a disease. But deciding that a certain patient has the disease and what the appropriate course of treatment for that person should be requires making judgments that go beyond the evidence. Such judgments depend heavily on what was done in similar cases in past experience. And that says something important about the nature of practical knowledge. Aristotle said that because of the importance of the role of experience in medicine, which was not an exact science, it would be wiser to choose an older than a younger doctor. In Aristotle's time there was awareness that medicine had been part of philosophy during the pre-Socratic period. Beginning in the medieval period, especially in Islamic culture, many philosophers had practical training as physicians and were employed as doctors to their patrons. That practice was also common through the Renaissance and early modern period in Europe. Another link between medicine and philosophy is that, as educated thinkers, philosophers have always had ideas about the human body and its functions, which in their scientific aspects have come from the medical views of their times. Philosophers have also maintained an interest in human emotions and thought processes, based on theories developed by psychologists and their predecessors before the science of psychology existed.
Who was Søren Kierkegaard?
Søren Abe Kierkegaard, 1813–1855, was a Danish Christian existentialist who extolled religious faith as an individual and emotional leap from all that was reasonable and rational. He wrote from his heart and the emotional circumstances of his own life.
What advances were made during the 19th century concerning the philosophy of mathematics and logic?
During the 19th century, a logical theory of probability was propounded. Non-Euclidean geometry was discovered, the objectivity and necessary truth of scientific first principles were questioned. A new system of logical notation was devised, and the possibility that mathematics could be reduced to logic was introduced.
How was skepticism related to the scientific revolution?
The re-emergence of ancient Greek skepticism toward the end of the Renaissance was not, at first, related to the rise of scientific inquiry. Rather, Catholic and Protestant theologians used skepticism as a tool to further argue their positions during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. And Catholics also used it to affirm mysticism and simple faith as the paths to real knowledge.
What is environmentalism?
Environmentalism is the study of the relationship between living organisms, including human beings, and natural environments, usually with the aim of preserving natural environments and renewable resources. Environmentalism is now a multifaceted, multidisciplinary field, extending widely into both theory and practice. Environmental philosophy has drawn on many traditions and subfields within philosophy, including ethics, social philosophy, continental philosophy, aesthetics, and feminism. Each of these areas refers basic questions about our relation to the environment to fundamental philosophical viewpoints.
Did Malebranche have a more extensive philosophy to support his theory of causation?
Yes, Malebranche was highly regarded as a theological metaphysician. In his major book, The Search After Truth, 1674, he developed his theory of vision in God. Malebranche agreed with René Descartes, 1596–1650, that ideas in the mind are the basic units of perception and knowledge. But he argued that our ideas are actually in God, rather than in us. This vision in God was especially important for abstract knowledge, according to Malebranche. Because universals, mathematical truths, and moral understanding were part of the vision in God. As such, they reflected God's knowledge of what was eternally true about the world he had created. In his treatise on Nature and Grace, 1680, Malebranche provided an explanation of how God's goodness, omnipotence, and omniscience could allow evil in the world. He claimed that God could have created a more perfect world without the known evils of the present one. This more or mostly perfect world, however, would have been more complicated than the world God did create. And creating that world would have contradicted God's principle of acting in the simplest possible way, according to general laws. This simplicity and generality could also explain the unequal distribution of grace among human beings.
Who was Hans Reichenbach?
Hans Reichenbach, 1891–1953, was the leader of logical empiricism. He was born in Hamburg and studied mathematics, physics, logic, and philosophy. He became a professor of philosophy of science at the University of Berlin and was a close associate of Albert Einstein. He founded Erkenntnis with Rudolf Carnap, 1891–1970, which was the premier journal of scientific philosophy in the 1930s. As with thousands of other Jews at the time, Reichenbach had to leave Germany in 1933. He first went to Istanbul before settling down at the University of California at Los Angeles. His main works include Experience and Prediction, 1938, The Theory of Probability, 1939 to 1949, and the posthumous The Direction of Time, 1956.
What did Hippias contribute to learning?
The sophist Hippias of Elis, c. 460 BCE, made a lot of money in his travels. He was polymathic, widely knowledgeable, and wrote poems, plays, histories, and speeches, as well as discussions of literature, astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, the arts, ethics, and mnemonics. He made an important mathematical discovery of the curve used to trisect an angle, the quadratrix. He argued against pre-Socratic posits of hidden reality and advocated self-sufficiency as a virtue. In conflicts between nature and convention, he is said to have advocated following nature. This meant that if he felt like doing something, and there was a rule against it, he was in favor of doing that thing and breaking the rule.
Who was Friedrich Schelling?
The literary and artistic romantics of his era deeply influenced the philosophy of Arthur Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, 1776 to 1854. He studied at Tübinger Stift, the seminary of the Protestant Church in Württemberg, and graduated from the philosophy faculty there in 1792. He then attended lectures at the University of Leipzig while working as a tutor to aristocratic youth. At the age of 23 he received an unprecedented offer to teach philosophy at the University of Jena. He subsequently held chairs at the universities at Würzburg, Erlangen, Munich, and finally Berlin, where he was expected to oppose the Hegelians. His primary motivation in philosophy appears to have been aesthetic, and he became known for his nature philosophy, as developed in his system of transcendental idealism, 1800.
Who was Themistocles?
According to some accounts, Pythagoras, c. 570 to 495 BCE, the pre-Socratic who founded a brotherhood based on the religious idea that everything is made up of numbers, was taught his ethical beliefs by Themistocles. c. 524 to 459 BCE, the priestess of Delphi. It is known that Apollo was both the god at the temple of Delphi and a deity worshipped by Pythagoreans. Pythagoras and his followers practiced self-examination and dietary and ritualistic purification, including their vegetarianism, based on a belief in the sameness of all life. This principle of sameness might have implied that women should be included in philosophical activities.
What was Spinoza's philosophical goal?
Spinoza's goal was the very practical one of how a person ought to live in the world. He sought a good, or a value, that would allow independence from the unpredictable, unpleasant, and uncontrollable aspects of human life, and he concluded that the ultimate good was awareness of one's place in nature, together with an acceptance of the natural order. Natural science, politics, ethics, education, and even technology were part of what had to be understood to achieve this complete understanding. Before such understanding, Spinoza said that the human mind was like a worm in a bloodstream that thought each drop of blood was an isolated thing, instead of part of a system within an organism. His philosophical task was to describe the whole in which individual humans were parts.
What did Parmenides and his Eleatic school believe?
Parmenides of Elea, c. 515 to 450 BCE, together with his two pupils, Zeno, c. 490 - 430 BCE, and Melissus of Samos. Fluid 440 BCE, formed the Eleatic school. Parmenides had the compelling idea of uniting the ultimate primary substance of everything with our perceived reality that seems to be composed of many different things. He argued forcefully that reality is an undifferentiated whole that is unmoving and unchanging. Parmenides dismissed change and the many different things that human beings ordinarily experience as mere appearance and illusion.
What was Friedrich Hegel's system?
Knowledge, according to Hegel, begins with logic, the subject of which is pure being. Although logic is always mediated in history, so that we do not see or experience logic in its pure form, but have to infer it from relations among events. Past philosophy represents different forms of consciousness that have progressed toward absolute knowledge or philosophical science. The progression of consciousness occurs because different forms of consciousness are contradictory and their inner dialectic resolves the contradictions via the emergence of new forms. This dialectic is not a dialogue between consciousnesses, but the inner development of what consciousness is conscious of. Hegel is able to chronicle this development of consciousness toward absolute knowledge, because it is presumed to be attained through his philosophical work.
What exactly was Parmenides' reasoning in his claims about the One?
Parmenides first assumed that reality, or what does not change, is one thing only. Given this, anything that is not that one thing is not real. Because something that is not real cannot have an effect on what is real, nothing can divide the one. The one, by definition, cannot move or change. Since the one is the only thing that is real, what we perceive as moving and changing is not real. Parmenides' student Zeno of Elea, c. 490–c. 430 BCE, defended the idea that reality is one and immobile and unchanging by showing how positing its movement and change results in absurdities. He is famous for his paradoxes. Melissus of Samos, fluid 440 BCE, added that the one is unbounded, or in our terms, infinite, and insisted that there could not be empty space.
What ideals for scientists did the early Royal Society promote?
After a rejection of Aristotelian ideals of certainty in scientific knowledge, members of the Royal Society sought what was no more than probably true. Their ideals included open-mindedness, cooperation, and goodwill toward colleagues. It was as important to know what one did not know as assert what one did. Here is how Thomas Sprat, in his 1667 History of the Royal Society, described the virtues of a virtuoso. The natural philosopher is to begin where the moral ends. It is requisite, that he who goes about such an undertaking, should first know himself, should be well practised in all the modest, humble, friendly virtues, should be willing to be taught, and to give way to the judgment of others. And I dare boldly say, that a plain, industrious man, so prepared, is more likely to make a good philosopher than all the high, earnest, insulting wits, who can neither bear partnership, nor opposition. For certainly, such men, whose minds are so soft, so yielding, so complying, so large, are in a far better way than the bold and haughty assertors. They will pass by nothing, by which they may learn. They will be always ready to receive, and communicate observations. They will not contemn the fruits of others' diligence. They will rejoice, to see mankind benefited, whether it be by themselves, or others.
Is there interest in the Marquis de Sade today?
Yes. The Marquis de Sade has endured as a glamorous and enigmatic film subject. The 1969 film De Sade was shot in Germany, and speculation about who its director really was continues to the present time. In 1996, the Marquis was revisited in Dark Prince, which was not a blockbuster. The most recent reprise is the 2000 movie Quills, starring Geoffrey Rush as the Marquis, Kate Winslet as Madeline, a teenager with whom de Sade has an affair, Joaquin Phoenix as the Abbé du Calmeyer, and Michael Caine as Dr. Royer Collard. The setting of Quills is an insane asylum in Napoleonic France. where the Marquis has been confined because of his licentious, depraved ideas that he graphically expresses in writing. Even while incarcerated, he has been getting his manuscripts out to be published. Napoleon himself is disturbed by this travesty and sends Dr. Royer Collard, a mental health specialist, to deal with the Marquis and cure him. Dr. Royer Collard is a hypocrite who abuses his young wife. The film turns on the conflict between the Abbé and Asada. The Abbé slowly goes mad, and the Marquis experiences remorse for the effect of his ideas on another. Overall, Quills is an aesthetically sophisticated film that dramatizes the continuously mordant wit of the Marquis de Sade, which coexisted with what would otherwise be unadorned pornography. In defying the optimism of the Age of Reason, he used its reigning weapon.
Who was C. I. Lewis?
C. I. Lewis, 1883 to 1964, was the most Kantian of all the pragmatists. Although he did not become a pragmatist until he read Charles Sanders Peirce's, 1839 to 1914, papers. When he was given an office in the library room where they were stored at Harvard. Lewis was born in Stoneham, Massachusetts. His father was a shoemaker who became barred from employment due to union activism. Lewis attended Harvard as an undergraduate and returned to get his Ph.D. there. After teaching in Colorado, he then went through the tenure process at the University of California and became well known for his work in symbolic logic. But he gave up his position as associate professor there to be an assistant professor in the Harvard Department of Philosophy in 1920, where he remained until 1953, serving twice as chair. Lewis was the most famous philosopher of his generation during the 1940s. But he had become obscure by the 1960s, largely due to the success of his student W.V. Quine. 1908 to 2000, Quine's success was largely based on the widespread acceptance of his refutation of the analytic/synthetic distinction, which was the cornerstone of Lewis' entire philosophical edifice. Lewis' main works are A Survey of Symbolic Logic, 1918, Symbolic Logic, 1932, which was written with C. H. Lanford, Mind and the World Order, 1929. An Analysis of Knowledge and Valuation, 1946, and The Ground and Nature of the Right, 1965.
What was Jean-Paul Sartre's basis for his idea of freedom?
Sartre argued that freedom was inherent in the very structure of human consciousness. To be conscious is to be free. Consciousness has no prior cause but is a spontaneous upsurge. Consciousness is nothing in itself, because it is always aware of something other than itself. Consciousness is freedom. Thus, consciousness is not a thing in itself. Sartre called consciousness the for itself, or pour soi, and everything else is the in itself, or en soi. At first glance, his division of the human cosmos into for itself and in itself resembles René Descartes' 1596–1650, doctrine of mental and physical substance. But Sartre went beyond Descartes' idea of the mental substance. For Sartre, as his hero in Nausea, 1938, discovers in the course of a research project, even a person's past meritorious acts or traits of character have the status of en soi. It is a form of bad faith. For example, to pretend that one is determined to fulfill his or her duty because that is how he or she was raised, or that one's laziness makes disciplined work impossible. People are responsible for allowing their own background, weaknesses, or strengths to be motives for action in the immediate present.
What was Hobbes' idea of the social contract?
The social contract was Hobbes' solution to the unpleasantness of life in the state of nature. It was an agreement among citizens to give up their individual powers to harm one another and transfer all of those powers to the sovereign, or Leviathan. In return, the sovereign would keep order, which would enable all the benefits of civilized life, such as a just legal system, education, marriage, security in property, and a flourishing of the arts and sciences. Hobbes' Leviathan, though, was to have totalitarian powers over his subjects, including the right over their lives, censorship, the right to draft them into military service, and to impose any other necessary burden of government. The only rights retained by subjects were the rights to preserve themselves and resist imprisonment or execution. Laws were literally the commands of the sovereign. Once the sovereign was made the irrevocable gift of power from the people, the only thing that could bring down the government would be its self-abdication or defeat by foreign enemies.
What is the philosophical issue regarding biological race?
In ordinary reality, it seems obvious that most people belong to one or another of a few major races due to biological differences. Actually, human biological sciences have failed to identify any physical essences that distinguish a race. And there are no stable physical traits that all members of any race share. For example, some black people have lighter skin hues than some white people. And overall there is greater variation of so-called racial traits within races than between races. When the human genome was mapped at the turn of the 21st century, geneticists reporting on the research emphasized that they had found no genes for race. Of course, the physical traits that count as racial are genetically inherited. But there is no difference in principle between those traits and others. Both globally and historically, criteria for racial membership have varied. In colonial times, a person was considered white if most of their great-grandparents were white. By 1900, the one-drop rule was in effect throughout the land. A person was considered black if there were any black ancestors, no matter how far back they were. The one-drop rule erased positive racial identities for Americans with both black and white ancestry they were, and to a large degree still are, considered black, rather than multiracial, mixed race, or biracial. The lack of a biological foundation for black or white racial identity has led some writers to suggest either that racial categories be eliminated or that racial identities be recognized as purely social. On that social basis, there is no rational reason why people with both black and white ancestry should not be recognized as mixed race, instead of automatically assigned to the black category. Others have tried to reconstruct less rigorous biological bases for race. And still others have argued that, within the African American tradition, race has always been understood to involve something more than biology.
Who were some other women philosophers of note from antiquity?
In the 3rd century c. E. Julia Domna, the wife of the Roman Emperor Septimius, supported a group of Stoic philosophers, studied with them, and helped them flourish. In the 4th century, Macrina preserved Greek philosophy after her family was persecuted by Christians.
Who or what were the Cambridge Apostles?
His was the undergraduate club at Cambridge University to which G. E. Moore, and some of the male writers who held him in high esteem, belonged. The Cambridge Apostles, or Cambridge Conversation Society, was founded in 1820 by George Tomlinson, who was later Bishop of Gibraltar. There were originally 12 members, hence the name. They met on Saturday nights for discussion after one member presented a paper and they ate whales, which were sardines on toast. The Apostles have always been a quasi-secret society with an annual dinner and a meeting in London every so often. Women could not be considered for membership until 1970, when the Cambridge spy ring was disclosed in 1951. 4 of its members were former apostles, and 2 who were employed in high government offices, had given the KGB sensitive information. The Cambridge spy ring consisted of 5 British young men who attended Cambridge University and were recruited to spy for the Soviet Union during the 1930s. They infiltrated the highest levels of British government and betrayed top secrets to the Soviet Union.
What did Francis Bacon contribute to the scientific revolution?
Francis Bacon, 1561–1626, systematized the methodology of empirical science and set forth a program for how science could better human life. He is famous for claiming, "Knowledge is power," and sought ways to further develop and apply the new sciences to human life in practical ways. He believed that human beings needed to master nature and conduct experiments to discover her secrets. 20th century feminists were to take Bacon to task for his assignment of a female gender to nature, compared to the maleness of scientists who were charged to conquer it.
What are the major themes in new philosophy?
Several factors stand out: a perceived need for philosophy to be relevant to current social concerns, the value of democracy, cultural pluralism, the importance of including women and non-whites who did not fully contribute to a history dominated by white males, and, above all, a strong revolt against ideas of objectivity, truth, and the perceived arrogance and hubris of previous philosophers. There is also a desire to make the subject of philosophy interesting to new students in a multimedia, electronic age.
What roles did others play in furthering Francis Bacon's ideas?
Samuel Hartlib, c. 1600 to 1662, a wealthy merchant with an interest in science, wrote description of the famous kingdom of Macaria, about a center of practical learning, inspired by Bacon's New Atlantis. Hartlib's friend, William Petty, 1623 to 1687, the founder of modern economics, envisioned a center for teaching practical trades, which he first proposed to Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691. A more theoretical precedent for these plans already existed in Gresham College, which was founded by Elizabeth I's financial agent in 1598. Professors there lectured on law, physics, rhetoric, divinity, music, geometry, and astronomy to scholars, nobles, and business and professional men.
Who was John Dewey?
John Dewey, 1859 to 1952, was the most famous philosopher in the United States during the early 20th century. He was a public intellectual during the decades when ordinary people, as well as intellectuals, filled halls to hear intellectually stimulating and edifying speeches. His interactive, pragmatic approach to ordinary life, education, and art appreciation has shaped American experience in fundamental ways that do not always refer to him by name. Although, or because, Dewey was shy, he wrote 37 books and more than 700 articles. His main publications include Psychology, 1887, Human Nature and Conduct, 1922, Experience and Nature. 1925, The Public and Its Problems, 1927, The Quest for Certainty, 1929, Philosophy and Civilization. 1932, A Common Faith. 1934, Art as Experience. 1934, Liberalism and Social Action. 1935, Logic, The Theory of Inquiry. 1938, Freedom and Culture. 1939, and Problems of Men. 1946.
Did women object to this negative view of them in the 17th century?
It is difficult to see how they had much opportunity to object. Before and after Oliver Cromwell's rise to power in England, public entertainment and behavior were often bawdy. By the time King William III ascended the throne in 1688, Puritanism dominated public morals, especially among the middle class. For some women, such as the successful playwright Alfra Ben, this was not good news. She wrote, "Though I the wondrous change deplore / that makes me useful and forlorn." But even during the wild times of the Tory Restoration, when sexuality was freely discussed and written about, and sexual relationships and desires were acknowledged as natural and tolerated in respectable society, Ben's explicit poetry and plays had rarely gone beyond the conventional wisdom that women were the dangerous sex. In her poem The Disappointment she relates Lysander's impotence when he is in the presence of the extremely desirable Chloris. Chloris flees, blushing with disdain and shame, and Lysander curses the shepherdess charm / whose soft betwitching influence / had damned him to the hell of impotence.
What is the linguistic turn?
During the last half of the 20th century, at different times in different humanistic disciplines, scholars turned from talking about people and events in the world to talking about language, symbols, and how people and events were represented in popular culture, as well as academic disciplines. Language became the new main subject across disciplines.
How is Christian philosophy different from Christian theology?
The main job of medieval Christian theologians was to intellectually work out the doctrine of the Catholic Church, without questioning its basic premises or the content of the religion that was based on the New Testament. The main job of medieval Christian philosophers was to explain how accepted knowledge that did not have Christian origins was compatible with Christian theology. This distinction was not made in the early church writings, such as those of Saint Augustine. What was St.
What did Paracelsus contribute to alchemy?
Paracelsus, 1493 to 1541, shared the Neoplatonic beliefs of most alchemists, decay is the beginning of all birth. Prime matter separates out of ultimate immaterial matter, and human creativity repeats this process. Time is a cycle composed of force and growing, and above and below, or heaven and earth, are the same in form. However, Paracelsus replaced the planetary theory of humors with a chemical one. Salt, sweet, bitter, sour, and the fifth element or quintessence life. His term ens natural referred to the balance of the chemical humors. And ens spiritual was the balance of the mind. Unlike many of his colleagues, Paracelsus did not think that insanity was caused by demons or that nightmares represented sexual intercourse with succubi. He taught that the mind can create diseases in itself. The body, or in the minds or bodies of others via hypnosis, magic, or ill will. He thought that most diseases are curable evils, but that no doctor can correct ens dei, or the will of God. Paracelsus was accused of heresy for his Neoplatonic notion of prime matter and for asserting that illness was not evil. Prime matter contradicted the idea that God created everything. Also, saying that illness was not evil left no room for the devil. But, after his death, his birthplace became a shrine for Roman Catholics.
What is Peter Abelard known for in philosophy?
Peter Abelard, 1079–1149, was the French theologian who wrote Theologia Christiana, an attempt to use logic for explaining Christian dogmas. His expertise in logic drew students from all over Europe. He was the first scholastic to write about Aristotle's On Interpretation, together with Boethius. 480 c. 525, commentary on this work. Abelard made a distinction between the meaning of an expression, what it names, and the idea in the mind of a speaker who uses the expression. He did not think that words signify the images in the minds of their speakers. Meanings are what true or false sentences say or signify, which lies outside the minds of their speakers. The distinctions in Abelard's innovative philosophical theory of reference remain relevant to contemporary philosophers of language.
What is Marxism?
Marxism is the doctrine attributed to Karl Marx, 1818–1883. That human society is divided into social classes and that the material or economic struggles among classes are the most important events on the big stage of history.